"You told me to know my place, officer." Judge Marcus Ellison's voice carried across the federal courtroom with a calm so complete that even the air seemed to stop moving. On the polished oak bench before him rested a pair of handcuffs, cold metal beneath the white courtroom lights, while Officer Daniel Whitmore stood alone near the center aisle, his face drained of confidence. Every attorney, clerk, reporter, and spectator had turned toward him. No one whispered. No one looked away. Marcus adjusted the sleeve of his black, judicial robe and continued. "Now this court will determine whether you understood yours." 17 minutes earlier, Whitmore had believed the man before him was nobody important. The morning had begun beneath a gray Baltimore sky, with rain tracing silver lines down the courthouse windows and traffic hissing across the wet pavement outside. Inside, the building moved with its usual restrained urgency. Shoes clicked against marble floors. Security scanners hummed. Lawyers carried folders thick with arguments, while families sat on wooden benches holding questions no legal document could fully answer. Marcus entered through the public doors wearing a charcoal suit, a navy tie, and a dark overcoat still carrying small beads of rain. There was no driver waiting at the curb, no security detail at his shoulder, and no judicial robe to announce his authority. He had spent most of the night at a hospital 2 miles away, sitting beside his mother after a minor medical emergency. Rather than return home, he had gone directly to the courthouse, carrying a worn leather briefcase in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. Inside that briefcase was a sealed federal case file concerning allegations of unlawful stops, falsified reports, and years of complaints that had somehow disappeared inside internal review. Marcus had read hundreds of pages before dawn, but one name remained fixed in his memory: Daniel Whitmore. Near Courtroom 4, Marcus paused beside the restricted entrance leading to the judge's chambers. His key card was inside his coat pocket. Before he could reach for it, a voice came from behind him. "That area is not for the public." Marcus turned and saw Whitmore standing 10 feet away in a courthouse security uniform, one hand resting near his radio. His expression carried no curiosity, only certainty. Marcus offered a polite nod. "I'm aware." Whitmore stepped closer. "Then you need to move." Marcus studied the officer's badge, then the nameplate above it. Daniel Whitmore. The same name printed across 3 misconduct summaries in the file he carried. For one brief second, something shifted behind Marcus's eyes, not fear, not surprise, but recognition. He removed his federal identification and held it out. "You may verify this with the clerk's office." Whitmore barely glanced at the card before handing it back. "I've seen people try this before." Around them, the courthouse continued moving, but more slowly now. A clerk stopped near the doorway. 2 attorneys lowered their voices. Marcus placed the identification carefully into his pocket. "Officer, follow the verification procedure." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You don't give instructions here." Marcus remained still as the rain tapped against the tall windows. "Then I suggest you call someone who does." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Years on the federal bench had taught him that authority did not become stronger when it became louder. Still, Whitmore mistook restraint for weakness. He shifted closer, blocking the narrow passage to the restricted hallway as though his body alone could settle the matter. "I already told you to move," he said. Marcus looked past him toward the clerk who had stopped near the doorway. Rebecca Sloan held a stack of case folders against her chest, her eyes moving from Marcus to Whitmore with growing concern. She recognized the judge immediately, but before she could speak, Whitmore lifted one hand and said, "Stay out of this." Rebecca froze. The courthouse seemed to shrink around the moment. The scanner continued to hum near the entrance. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed with a soft wooden thud. Marcus reached slowly into his coat and removed his identification again. "Read the name," he said. Whitmore gave the card a quick glance, then smirked. "Anyone can print something that looks official. Then verify it. I do not need instructions from you." The words landed harder than their volume suggested. Marcus watched him carefully, not only as a man being challenged, but as a judge observing evidence in real time. The refusal to verify, the assumption of guilt, the confidence that procedure applied only when convenient. Each detail matched the language in the sealed reports inside the leather briefcase. Behind Whitmore, 2 attorneys had stopped speaking. A court reporter stood near the wall, holding a coffee cup in both hands. An older man seated on a bench leaned forward, listening. No one knew exactly who Marcus was, but they could see what was happening. Marcus slid the identification back into his pocket. Officer Whitmore, I am asking you one final time to contact the United States Marshals Service. The use of his name unsettled him. His eyes narrowed. How do you know who I am? Marcus glanced at the nameplate on his uniform. You are wearing it. A quiet breath moved through the hallway, almost like the beginning of a laugh, but no one allowed it to become one. Whitmore turned toward the small audience, embarrassed by the reaction. When he faced Marcus again, his tone had changed. It was sharper now, more personal. People like you come into places like this and think the rules do not apply. Rebecca stepped forward. Officer, you need to stop. Whitmore pointed toward her without looking away from Marcus. Another word, and I will remove you from the building. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. This is my workplace. Then act like it. Marcus felt the weight of the morning settle over him. He thought of the young man named in the case file, a college student who had shown identification during a traffic stop and had still been treated as suspicious. He thought of the 3 complaints carrying Whitmore's name, each dismissed for lack of sufficient evidence. Now the pattern stood 10 feet in front of him under bright federal lights. Marcus lifted his briefcase slightly. This contains sealed court material. You are not authorized to handle it. Whitmore looked at the case, then back at Marcus. We will see about that. He reached for the handle, but Marcus kept his grip steady. The room went silent. Officer, Marcus said, his voice low and precise. You should think very carefully about what you do next. Whitmore released the briefcase handle, but only for a moment. His pride had already taken control of the situation, and every watching face seemed to push him further from reason. Marcus could see it clearly. The officer was no longer trying to secure the courthouse. He was trying to defend the image of himself as the only man in the hallway whose authority mattered. Set the case down, Whitmore ordered. Marcus remained still. You have been told that it contains sealed federal material. And you have been told that I am in charge of security. Security requires verification. You have refused to verify anything. Rebecca took another step forward, her folders trembling slightly against her chest. Officer Whitmore, please listen to me. This man has access to that hallway. Whitmore turned toward her with open irritation. Did I ask for your opinion? It is not an opinion. Her voice was quieter now, but firmer. I know who he is. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Whitmore's face. It lasted less than a second. Then he buried it beneath a dismissive laugh. Of course you do. The attorneys near the wall exchanged glances. The older man on the bench stood slowly, one hand resting on his cane. Maybe you should check the identification, he said. Whitmore looked around as if the entire hallway had suddenly become disobedient. Everyone needs to step back. No one moved. The silence was different now. Before, it had been cautious. Now it carried judgment. Marcus lowered his coffee cup onto a nearby windowsill and held the briefcase at his side. He had entered the courthouse tired from a sleepless night, concerned for his mother, and focused on the case awaiting him. He had not expected to become part of the evidence. Yet every word Whitmore spoke seemed to confirm what the written complaints had struggled to prove. The officer did not ask questions when he believed the person before him held no power. He issued commands. He made assumptions. He treated explanation as defiance. Marcus had spent nearly 2 decades watching people reveal themselves under pressure. Some became honest. Some became afraid. Others became exactly who they had always been. You said you know who I am, Whitmore said to Rebecca. Then tell me why he is standing outside a restricted entrance without an escort. Rebecca opened her mouth, but Marcus raised one hand gently. Do not answer for me. Whitmore smiled as though he had won something. That is what I thought. Marcus looked directly at him. No, you have already been given every opportunity to correct this. He reached into his coat once more, not for identification, but for the key card to the chambers. The small federal seal caught the light as he held it near the electronic reader. A green signal appeared. The lock clicked open. The sound was soft, almost ordinary, but it changed the hallway completely. Rebecca exhaled. One attorney lowered his eyes. The court reporter stared at Whitmore, waiting for him to understand. He did not. Instead, his face hardened. That card could have been stolen. Marcus studied him in silence. Imagine standing before proof and choosing prejudice because admitting the truth would cost you your pride. That was the choice Whitmore made. He stepped between Marcus and the open doorway. You are not going anywhere until I determine how you got that. Marcus glanced at the clock above the courtroom doors. 9:43. 17 minutes remained before the session began. Then you should use those minutes wisely, he said. Whitmore leaned closer, lowering his voice as if cruelty became acceptable when spoken quietly. Men like you need to learn that you cannot walk into a federal building and act like you own the place. Marcus did not flinch. His gaze moved briefly to the officer's nameplate, then back to his eyes. I do not own this place, he said. The public does. I am here to serve it. Whitmore's expression tightened at the word serve, as though the idea itself offended him. To Marcus, public service meant restraint, accountability, and the willingness to listen before acting. To Whitmore, it seemed to mean obedience. From everyone standing on the other side of his uniform. Close that door, he ordered. Marcus left the chamber's entrance open. The card worked, Rebecca said. You saw it. Whitmore ignored her. He reached toward his radio, but instead of requesting verification, he reported a suspicious individual attempting to enter a secured judicial area. His description was brief, vague, and carefully stripped of every fact that might have challenged his version of events. Marcus listened without interruption. When Whitmore finished, he pointed toward the public seating inside Courtroom 4. You can wait in there until someone decides what to do with you. Marcus glanced through the open doors. Attorneys were arranging exhibits at their tables. A few reporters had already taken seats along the rear wall. The great seal above the bench reflected the pale morning light, and the judge's chair remained empty, waiting for the man now being treated like an intruder. I have business in chambers, Marcus said. Not anymore. You do not have the authority to make that decision. Whitmore gave a humorless smile. Around here, I decide who belongs where. The hallway fell silent again. Rebecca's face changed first. Shock gave way to anger, not loud anger, but the kind that straightened her shoulders and steadied her hands. One of the attorneys near the wall took out a telephone and began recording openly. Whitmore noticed. Put that away. The attorney shook his head. This is a public corridor. I said put it away. And I said you should verify his credentials. More people turned toward them. A law student seated near the courtroom entrance rose slowly. The older man with the cane remained standing. No one knew the full truth, but they no longer needed to know Marcus's position to recognize the wrongness of what they were witnessing. That was the moment the balance began to shift. Not because Marcus had revealed his title. Not because a higher authority had arrived. It shifted because ordinary people stopped accepting silence as neutrality. Whitmore felt it too. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for agreement and finding none. Everyone inside, he demanded. Now. Marcus stepped toward the courtroom, not because Whitmore had commanded it, but because the next stage of the truth was waiting there. As he crossed the threshold, Whitmore followed closely behind him. You are going to stand in the rear until this is sorted out. Marcus turned. The rear. Whitmore pointed toward the section near the defense tables. Back there, where people like you wait. A quiet gasp passed through the room. Rebecca entered behind them. Officer Whitmore, stop this immediately. He did not look at her. His attention remained fixed on Marcus, fueled now by the need to force submission before the growing audience. Marcus studied him with the patience of a man allowing the record to become complete. Where exactly do you believe my place is? He asked. Whitmore pointed again, this time toward the seats reserved for defendants awaiting their cases. There. And until someone proves otherwise, you will stay there. Marcus looked toward the empty bench, then at the clock above the courtroom doors. 9:47. 13 minutes remained. He walked to the designated seat and placed his briefcase beside him with deliberate care. Whitmore mistook the movement for surrender. He did not understand that Marcus was not yielding. He was giving the officer one final opportunity to hear himself clearly before the entire courtroom learned the truth. Marcus sat in the seat Whitmore had chosen for him, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly over the handle of the leather briefcase. Around him, the courtroom had become unusually still. The low conversations between attorneys had stopped. Papers no longer shuffled. Even the quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed louder beneath the weight of what everyone had just heard. Whitmore remained near the aisle, watching Marcus with the satisfied expression of a man who believed compliance had proven him right. Stay there, he said. Marcus looked up at him. You have made your instruction clear. Good. Whitmore turned toward the doorway, but Rebecca stepped into his path. You need to call Marshal Reed. I already called for support. You reported a suspicious person. You did not ask anyone to verify his identity. Whitmore lowered his voice. You are getting very close to interfering with an officer. Rebecca did not move. And you are getting very close to creating a record you will not be able to explain. The attorney holding the telephone kept recording. Another lawyer had opened a notebook and begun writing down the exact time. 9:48. Marcus noticed each detail without appearing to look. He had spent years teaching juries that truth was often built from small, ordinary facts. A clock, a name, a refusal to follow procedure, a sentence spoken when someone believed no consequence would follow. The older man with the cane moved closer to the defense rail. Sir, he said to Whitmore, that gentleman showed identification, opened the secured door, and had a court employee confirm him. What else do you need? Whitmore faced him sharply. You need to sit down. I have been sitting quietly for 20 minutes, the man replied. Quiet does not mean blind. A murmur of agreement moved through the courtroom. Whitmore's confidence began to fracture at the edges. He pointed toward the public gallery. All of you will remain seated and stop interfering. No one answered. No one needed to. Their expressions said enough. Marcus opened his briefcase carefully and removed the sealed folder. Across the front, in dark federal lettering, was his full name and judicial title. Whitmore saw it from several feet away. His eyes paused on the words, but instead of asking a question, he reached for another explanation. Where did you get that? Marcus rested the folder on his lap. It was assigned to me. That does not answer the question. It answers it completely. Whitmore stepped nearer. Hand it over. Marcus's voice remained even. You are not authorized to review sealed judicial material. You do not decide what I am authorized to do. Rebecca looked toward the clock. 9:50. 10 minutes until the scheduled session. Officer Whitmore, she said, the person who decides that is sitting in front of you. The words settled over the room. Whitmore looked at Marcus, then at Rebecca, then back at the folder. For the first time, doubt remained on his face. Longer than a second. Still, pride would not let him accept what reason had already made obvious. I do not care what story the two of you arranged, he said. Until someone with actual authority comes through that door, he stays where I put him. Marcus slowly closed the folder. Be careful, he said, when you ask authority to enter a room. It may already be listening. At that moment, the door beside the judge's bench opened, and the first polished footsteps of the United States Marshal Service echoed across the courtroom floor. The footsteps stopped beside the bench, and Chief United States Marshal Thomas Reed entered through the side door with 2 deputies behind him. He carried no visible urgency, yet the room changed the moment he appeared. Conversations vanished. Chairs became still. Whitmore straightened, relieved to see someone he assumed would confirm his authority. Chief Reed, he said, stepping forward. I detained a man attempting to enter the judicial chambers with questionable identification and sealed documents. Reed did not answer him. His eyes moved past Whitmore and found Marcus seated near the defense rail. For a brief moment, disbelief crossed his face. Then his expression hardened. Why is Judge Ellison sitting there? The question traveled through the courtroom like a sudden current. Whitmore blinked. Rebecca closed her eyes and released the breath she had been holding. The attorney recording the scene lowered his telephone slightly, not because the moment had ended, but because the truth had finally spoken for itself. Judge, Whitmore repeated. Reed turned toward him. The Honorable Marcus Ellison, the federal judge assigned to this courtroom. Whitmore looked at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. The charcoal suit had not changed. The worn briefcase had not changed. The identification card in his pocket had not changed. Only the value Whitmore assigned to the man before him had changed, and everyone in the room understood why. There must have been a misunderstanding, Whitmore said. Marcus rose slowly. A misunderstanding ends when accurate information is provided. His voice was calm, but every word carried across the room. You were shown federal identification. You watched a secured door open with my key card. A court clerk confirmed my access. Several witnesses asked you to verify the facts. Whitmore glanced toward Rebecca. She never clearly said he was a judge. Rebecca stared at him. You ordered me to be silent before I could finish. Reed stepped between them, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable authority of someone restoring order. Officer Whitmore, step away from Judge Ellison. Whitmore obeyed at last. Marcus picked up his briefcase and walked toward the side door. No one spoke as he passed. The same aisle that had been used to place him among defendants now led him toward the bench. Rebecca followed and returned moments later carrying a neatly pressed black judicial robe. Marcus removed his overcoat and slipped into the robe with quiet precision. The transformation was simple, almost ceremonial, yet it exposed the entire failure of Whitmore's judgment. Marcus had been worthy of dignity before the robe. The cloth merely forced the officer to recognize what he should have recognized without it. Reed took his position near the bench and looked across the courtroom. All rise for the United States District Court, the Honorable Judge Marcus Ellison presiding. Chairs moved at once. Attorneys stood. Reporters stood. The older man with the cane pushed himself upright. Rebecca stood beside the clerk's desk. Even Whitmore rose, though his face had lost all trace of its earlier certainty. Marcus entered from chambers and took his place behind the polished oak bench. He looked over the courtroom, then toward the officer who had told him where he belonged. "Be seated," he said. Everyone sat except Whitmore. He remained in the aisle, uncertain whether he was permitted to move. Marcus placed the sealed folder before him. "Officer Whitmore, you told this court that you were waiting for someone with actual authority to enter the room." Whitmore swallowed. "Your Honor, I can explain." Marcus held his gaze. "You will have that opportunity. You will also listen while every witness receives the same one." Whitmore remained standing while the rest of the courtroom sat in. Silence. The black judicial robe on Marcus's shoulders did not make him more deserving of respect than he had been 10 minutes earlier, but it changed the way Whitmore looked at him. That change was visible to everyone. Marcus opened the sealed folder and placed one page beside the court calendar. "Before this morning's scheduled matter begins, the court must preserve the record of what occurred in this building." Whitmore shifted his weight. "Your Honor, I believe there was a security concern." "Belief does not replace procedure," Marcus replied. "And suspicion does not become evidence simply because it is spoken by someone wearing a uniform." Chief Marshal Reed moved to the clerk's desk and quietly instructed a deputy to secure the hallway camera footage, the radio transmission, and every available recording from the previous 15 minutes. The attorney near the aisle raised his telephone. "I recorded most of the exchange," he said. Marcus nodded. "Provide a copy to the clerk. Keep the original unchanged." Rebecca took her seat and opened a fresh page in the court log. Her hand no longer trembled. The older man with the cane was invited forward to give his name and contact information as a witness. One by one, the people who had watched in silence became part of the record. Whitmore looked around the room as if searching for someone willing to defend him. He found only faces that had seen too much. "I made a judgment call," he said. Marcus looked down at the file. "That is precisely the concern." He lifted a document bearing Whitmore's name. "This court was scheduled today to review allegations connected to unlawful stops, false reporting, and repeated failures to verify identification before detention." Whitmore's face changed. The earlier embarrassment gave way to alarm. "I am not a party to that case." "Not formally," Marcus said, "but your name appears in 3 separate complaint summaries." A murmur moved through the gallery. Chief Marshal Reed stepped closer to the bench, reading the page Marcus handed him. His expression grew severe. The same officer who had insisted Marcus did not belong near the chambers had just placed himself inside the center of a case he did not know was waiting for him. "Those complaints were closed," Whitmore said quickly. "They were reviewed. They were dismissed for insufficient corroboration," Marcus answered. "This morning may have provided what those individuals did not have." Whitmore stared toward the camera mounted above the courtroom entrance. For the first time, he seemed to notice it. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "You were given identification. You refused to examine it. You were shown authorized access. You dismissed it. You were offered confirmation by a court employee. You silenced her. Then you placed a black man in the section reserved for defendants because you had already decided what kind of person he must be." The room held its breath. "Your Honor, I did not know who you were." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "That is not your defense, Officer Whitmore. That is the evidence." No one moved. No one whispered. The words did not strike with anger. They settled with truth. Marcus closed the folder. "The question is not whether you would have treated a federal judge differently. The question is how many people without a robe, a title, or a courtroom full of witnesses receive the same treatment and were never believed. Chief Marshal Reed looked toward Whitmore. "Officer, surrender your courthouse credentials pending an independent review." Whitmore's hand moved slowly toward the identification clipped to his uniform. The badge that had seemed so powerful minutes earlier now looked small beneath the courtroom lights. Marcus watched without satisfaction. This was not revenge. It was the beginning of accountability. Whitmore removed the courthouse credential from his uniform and placed it in Chief Marshal Reed's open hand. The small plastic card made almost no sound, yet the moment carried more weight than any shouted command. For years, that credential had opened doors, ended conversations, and made strangers obey before they understood why. Now it rested between two men who no longer accepted it as proof of character. "This review will be independent," Reed said. "You will not contact witnesses, access internal records, or discuss this incident with courthouse staff until you receive formal instructions." Whitmore looked toward Marcus. "Your Honor, I understand how this appears." Marcus's expression did not change. "The court is concerned with what occurred, not merely how it appears." He turned to Rebecca. "Please mark every recording, statement, and security log for preservation." "Yes, Your Honor." Her response was clear and immediate. Marcus then addressed the courtroom. "The scheduled hearing cannot proceed under these circumstances." Several attorneys glanced toward one another, uncertain whether the entire matter would be delayed. Marcus continued, "Because my personal experience this morning may overlap with the allegations before the court, I will recuse myself from all decisions concerning Officer Whitmore." The announcement surprised Whitmore more than punishment would have. He had expected anger. Perhaps he had even prepared himself for humiliation in return. Instead, Marcus gave him the very fairness he had refused to give anyone else. "Another federal judge will review the evidence," Marcus said. "The United States Attorney's Office will determine whether further action is appropriate. The Inspector General will receive copies of the complete record. No decision will be made by me." Reed gave a quiet nod. The distinction mattered. Marcus was not using the bench to settle a personal score. He was protecting the process from even the appearance of retaliation. That restraint changed the room again. The people watching no longer saw only a powerful man confronting the officer who had insulted him. They saw the difference between authority used for dignity and authority used for control. Assistant United States Attorney Elena Brooks entered through the rear doors carrying a blue file box. She had arrived for the scheduled hearing and stopped when she saw Whitmore without his credential. Rebecca met her near the clerk's desk and explained what had happened in a low voice. Elena's eyes moved toward Marcus, then toward the sealed folder on the bench. "Your Honor," she said, "the government has additional material relevant to the complaint summaries." Marcus motioned for her to continue. Elena opened the file box and removed a stack of documents. These include traffic camera records, dispatch logs, and statements from 7 individuals whose complaints were previously closed. Several described the same pattern observed here this morning. Whitmore stared at the documents. 7. Elena looked directly at him. 7 who were willing to come forward again. The older man with the cane lowered his head. The attorney who had recorded the incident stopped writing. The number changed everything. Whitmore's behavior was no longer a single failure made under pressure. It was a repeated choice, hidden until enough voices finally stood in the same room. Marcus looked across the gallery. "Every affected case will be reviewed," he said. "Every person who was dismissed without a complete inquiry will be contacted. Their credibility will not depend on whether they hold public office." Whitmore's shoulders fell. For the first time that morning, he appeared smaller than the power he had claimed. Marcus leaned back in the judge's chair, but there was no satisfaction in his face. "Officer Whitmore, what happened to me matters," he said. "But it matters because it reveals what may have happened to people whose names were easier to ignore." Reed directed a deputy to escort Whitmore from the courtroom. No one celebrated as he left. There was no applause, no laughter, and no revenge in the silence that followed. Only the steady beginning of a truth that had waited far too long to be heard. 6 weeks later, the same federal courtroom looked unchanged, but nothing inside it felt the same. The oak bench still reflected the pale morning light. The flag stood beside the seal. The wooden gallery seats carried the quiet weight of people waiting to be heard. Yet this time, Marcus Ellison did not enter through the door behind the bench. He walked through the public entrance in a dark suit and took a seat in the second row beside Rebecca Sloan, the older man with the cane, and several families whose complaints had once been dismissed. He was not there as the presiding judge. He was there as a witness to a process larger than himself. Another federal judge had been assigned to oversee the case, and an independent review had already reopened 11 arrests connected to Daniel Whitmore. 3 reports had been corrected. 2 cases had been dismissed after investigators found that key information had been omitted. Several former complainants had received formal apologies, though Marcus knew an apology could not return lost time or erase the feeling of being treated as though truth belonged only to people with titles. Near the front of the courtroom, Elena Brooks arranged the final documents at the government table. Chief Marshal Thomas Reed stood near the side wall, his posture composed, his attention fixed on every detail. Then the rear doors opened. Whitmore entered without a uniform, without a radio, and without the courthouse credential that had once made him believe every room belonged to him. He wore a plain gray suit and carried nothing but a folder provided by his attorney. His eyes moved first toward the bench, then toward Marcus. For a moment, the 2 men looked at each other across the room. Marcus offered no smile and no expression of triumph. He had not come to watch a man fall. He had come to see whether the system would finally stand for those it had previously asked to remain silent. The clerk rose. All rise. Every person in the courtroom stood. Marcus stood with them. So did Rebecca. So did the families whose names had once appeared only in forgotten complaint files. Whitmore stood as well, but now the command did not come from his voice. It came from an institution that demanded the same respect from everyone and owed the same protection in return. The new judge entered and took the bench. After reviewing the evidence, the court accepted Whitmore's resignation from public service, imposed a permanent restriction preventing him from holding a federal courthouse security position, and referred the remaining findings to the appropriate state authorities. More important than his professional consequences was the order requiring a full independent audit of every case in which his conduct had been questioned. The decision did not erase what had happened. It created a path for truth to continue moving. When the proceeding ended, people slowly left the courtroom. Whitmore remained near the aisle, looking toward Marcus as though searching for words. At last, he approached. "Judge Ellison," he said quietly, "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Marcus held his gaze. "You knew enough to treat me like a human being." Whitmore lowered his eyes. There was nothing more to say. Marcus walked toward the doors with the families beside him. Behind them, the courtroom lights remained bright over the empty bench. Whitmore had once believed a badge could decide where a black man belonged. In the end, the law taught him that dignity has no assigned seat, and justice does not ask a person to prove their worth before granting them respect.